Many people speak about the traditional Latin Mass, a beautiful rite that I appreciate, and I think everybody should know this rite a little bit more. But did you know that in the traditional Latin Mass, you actually have two different Latin languages in the same Mass? I don't think many people have actually captured this. If same as in the English Mass today, in the translated English Mass in various places, you have two versions of English. You know, an English that is no longer actually spoken today. It's not the lingua franca. It's not the vernacular that we use to speak. For example, Our Father who art in heaven. Nobody says, how art you today? And, that archaic form of English isn't in use today. And English has evolved, dramatically over the last 800 years. If you look at some of the earliest English translations and you try to pronounce them or read them today, you would find it very, very difficult. I say this because some of the first Irish English dictionary was written by somebody in my family. They were writing a dictionary for Queen Elizabeth I, and that dictionary had English and it had Latin and it had Irish. And one day I looked up the dictionary, the very like a scanned copy of the dictionary. I said, "Wow, it's really different. This 15th century document to the English that we would know today." But the same happened with the Latin that we have in the Latin Mass. Many people think that Saint Jerome translated the Bible into Latin. Not exactly. He did. He was the first to do a complete translation. That is true into Latin, but he didn't translate it into the Latin that would have been used when Christ was alive. The Latin that Christ would have heard the Roman legionaries use while they were crucifying him. The Latin that you would have heard Roman centurions use around Jerusalem or various parts of Israel. That Latin was not the Latin that was used by St. Jerome to translate the Bible. If you take out your traditional Latin Mass Missal, and in the Old Rite you have set Gospels. If we go to the Gospel of the Gospel for what night? It's the night Mass, the midnight Mass in the traditional Latin Rite, and you have the Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 to 14, and we go to the end of it, and we hear the Gloria translation. And this is the St. Jerome Gloria translation. Gloria in Altissimis Deo, et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis. Oh, okay, Gloria in Altissimis Deo. But isn't the Gloria that we sing Latin? Why wouldn't we use that same prayer, because it's biblical? Why wouldn't we use that same prayer in the Gloria? And the thing is, you have vulgar Latin and you have vetus Latin in the same Mass. So if we go to the Gloria, and it's Gloria in excelsis Deo. But in the Jerome translation to vulgar Latin in the 4th century, he uses Gloria in Altissimi Deo. You also see this with the Our Father. In the Our Father in the traditional Latin Mass, it has vetus Latin, but in the vulgar you have a different translation of daily bread. And again, this whole way of translating daily bread, you could do a whole podcast on that, but it's just interesting to see the two Latins used in the same missal. On one side you have Saint Jerome's Latin, and in the Gloria you have the old Latin. There still exists Vetus Latin texts, manuscripts. I think it's Vercelli manuscript from one of the earliest manuscripts that you can read and see the two Latins really, because when I learned Latin, and again I was just cast into it, I had no idea about the language. The Latin I learned was ecclesiastical Latin, which is the vulgar Latin that was kind of standardized by the church after St. Jerome and perpetuated in the church, and still the Latin that church Latin that we have today. And then along comes Erasmus in trying to understand and revive the old understanding of Latin and the way it was pronounced. Because the Latin that we use in the Mass is not the Latin that Christ would have heard in Jerusalem. It's a different language. It's a different Latin. And if you were to, in reality, the two of them, they would maybe struggle to actually understand each other. How do we know how Latin was pronounced during the time of Christ? The thing is, with language, Latin stood in the world alongside other different languages that we know today. So the same as some English words were kind of lent into Spanish or Italian, you often hear the words like weekend spoken in Italy or Spain. Well, it's the same in Greece. They would have, for example, have translated some Roman poetry into Greek. And along with that, they would have translated, for example, the name of the poet. So if you were to take somebody like Cicero, how would his name have been pronounced when he was alive in Rome? And it wouldn't have been like we have in ecclesiastical Latin. I think it's Cicero, same in Italian. In Greek, they transcribed his name into Greek, Cicero. I'm nearly sure. I'm not a Latin doctor at all. This is just a pastime, a hobby for me, that I find languages absolutely fascinating. Because we use language to communicate so much, and to catechize and to teach, and the whole debate on liturgy and language is utterly fascinating to me, because what St. Jerome was trying to do, or what he did, was to translate the Bible into a language that people were using, the vulgar language, the everyday language of his time, which he did. I'm just giving you the example of the Gloria. Gloria in Excelsis Deo was the Vetus Latin, and Gloria in Altissimi Deo is the vulgar Latin of the time of St. Jerome. And even just St. Jerome, he had his critics. St. Augustine wasn't totally happy with the new translation, because they would have been used to the old Vetus Latin text that probably Saint Augustine had read. I'm just going to bring up something else here for you. There in the Vercellanis manuscript, if you think about the Gospels, the second Gospel in that manuscript is the Gospel of Saint John. So even the numbering of the Gospels was different. Matthew, John, I think, and then the other two Gospels. But if we think about the very word, or verbum Dei, the Word of God. But that's not how it would actually have been pronounced during the time of Christ. And this is going to find, this is maybe, people will find this fascinating, even if you think about Veni, Vidi, Vinci. I came, I saw, I conquered. What if you were to hear that in its original language? And so I'm just going to read you the start of the Gospel of St. John in its original translated Latin. Not the Jerome translation, the original translation. In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum, hoc erat in principio, apud Deum omnia per illum facta sunt, et sine illu factum est nihil quod factum est, et in illu vita est, et vita erat lux hominum, et lux in tenebris lucit, et tenebrae eum non comprehenderunt. So what you can see is the V, vita, would have been pronounced vita, or verbum, the same as ecce homo, behold the man, would have been ecce homo. And again, there's a whole study being done on this by far greater experts over the centuries, comparing, as again, words that were literally the phonetically transcribed into other languages. So a Latin word that its phonetics are written in Greek. So you could say, okay, well, this is phonetically how they transcribed the word into different languages, or sometimes even graffiti that has graffiti that people have written, and this you see this more in Spanish than in English sometimes. You often see badly written Spanish words that in reality they're just writing what they have heard. Little children sometimes, they don't understand the correct spelling, and they just write phonetically what they've. Well, it's the same that happened in early Rome. Anyway, it was just kind of to kind of draw people into the two versions of the Latin that actually still to this day exist not only in the traditional Latin Mass, but some of this is in the Latin the Latin version of the Novus Ordo, and you have, as I said, you could have Saint Jerome Latin in the Mass, and then you have the Vetus Latin in the Mass, and then you have the ecclesiastical pronunciation. So two Latins and the vulgar Latin pronunciation that has been perpetuated to in ecclesiastical circles to this day. What I find interesting about this whole language discussion is sometimes Maria Valtorta, when she is hearing dictations, she hears a word she doesn't understand, and she transcribes some Aramaic words. It doesn't often happen because most of the time the dictation she's being given is in Italian, but sometimes she is given words in their original language. Like sometimes she hears the month in Aramaic. And so through the works of Maria Valtorta, she is going between two different understandings of time. The Old Aramaic time, the Old Aramaic or Hebrew months, she's Tevet or Nisan or etc., etc. And she's also hearing various different words that, don't make sense to her. And yet, many people afterwards, this is some of the science in Marie Valtorta's writings, have been able to correlate some of these words to actual Aramaican words that would have been used during that time. And I suppose the whole thing I find fascinating is trying to translate, or trying to understand these different languages in our modern day. There's a whole science behind this. There's a whole world to be discovered. Sometimes I think in our technological age we miss the whole wealth of knowledge. Also with poetry, ancient Roman and Latin poetry, if you know how it was pronounced and you pronounce it correctly, the poetry rhymes properly. It's the same with Shakespeare. If you try to pronounce Shakespeare today with modern pronunciation, it doesn't rhyme. But if you go back and pronounce Shakespeare, especially some of his poetry, how he would have pronounced it, it rings perfectly. And you can find many of examples of that. But anyway, I just hope that next time you're going to a traditional Latin Mass and you hear the Gospel being read in Latin, St. Luke, and you hear Gloria in St. Jerome's Latin translation, and you hear the Gloria as it's sung, you remember the two Latins that are found in the same missal. And it must have been a bit like the Russians, the Orthodox Church in Russia. They made kind of some small translations that were more faithful to the early Greek translations, and it split the Russian Orthodox Church because some people weren't happy with the changes. They said, "Oh, I prefer the old things better," and you have old Church Orthodox and you have the new church, and it wasn't like any massive major reform in the Orthodox Church. It was some very, very, very basic things. I am sure in the 4th century, when you came along with St. Jerome's new translation, I'm sure some people said, "I don't like this Gloria in Altissima. I prefer my Gloria in Excelsis. I'm sticking with the old translation," which they did. It remained. So to this day, the Our Father is not St. Jerome's translation of the Our Father, or the Gloria, as I said, in that song, is not St. Jerome's translation of the Gloria. So you have a mixture of two Latin languages, and you have them pronounced as it was during the fourth century, the ecclesiastical, the language that was spoken at that time. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, let me know. It'll spur you on. And next time you hear Veni, Vidi, Vinci, you remember it should be pronounced Weni, Vidi, Wiki, which people might find interesting. But that is the literal pronunciation as it was when it was first pronounced. In principio erat verbum, and that might people verbum Dei. It'll be interesting if that catches on at Mass. I don't think so, but that is how Christ would have heard that language used around him during his time. Anyway, God bless you. Take care. Bye bye.